On May 10, 1940, the world awoke to thunder. Across the Low Countries of Europe, the rumble of engines shook the ground as columns of steel advanced in unison. These were not the lumbering relics of the First World War. No, these machines were faster, stronger, deadlier. The German Panzer divisions, sleek and formidable, spearheaded a new kind of war, one the world had never seen before. Their armor glistened in the spring light, their treads carving paths through fields and villages, their guns ready to unleash fury. Behind them trailed the Luftwaffe above and legions of infantry below, moving with a precision that stunned both friend and foe alike. The Blitzkrieg had begun. And with it, the legend of the German tank was born. For those who witnessed it, the sight was unforgettable. Civilians fled in terror, farmers abandoned their homes, and entire armies were crushed in days. At Sedan, French defenses that had been deemed impenetrable collapsed in less than 48 hours. The myth of Allied superiority was shattered by the relentless momentum of these armored beasts. Soldiers who once marched confidently now found themselves running, their rifles useless against steel giants that could outpace and outgun them with ease. But legends, no matter how fearsome, are never eternal. As the war dragged on, the battlefield would change. Nations that once trembled beneath the treads of panzers would rise again, forging weapons of their own, developing tactics to blunt the German spearhead, and turning fear into fury. The tide of war would shift, and the machines that once ruled with absolute dominance would find themselves hunted, broken, and burning on battlefields from North Africa to the Eastern Front. This is the story of how German tanks once ruled the battlefield, until the Allies fought back. The story of German tanks begins not in the triumph of conquest, but in the bitter ashes of defeat. After the First World War, Germany was shackled by the Treaty of Versailles, forbidden from building or deploying tanks. The victors of 1918 believed that by stripping Germany of armored might, they had ensured the nation would never again unleash mechanized terror upon Europe. Yet, in the dark corridors of military thought, German officers refused to surrender to history's verdict. Men like Heinz Guderian, a sharp and restless mind, studied every scrap of information on mechanized warfare. He read the theories of British innovators like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, who spoke of fast-moving armored thrusts that could bypass trench stalemates. Where others dismissed these ideas, Guderian believed them to be the future. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of foreign inspectors, Germany quietly experimented. Secret training schools were set up in the Soviet Union, far from Versailles' restrictions, where German officers practiced maneuvers with mock-ups and wooden frames, dreaming of machines they were not yet allowed to build. These dreams would soon harden into steel. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he tore up the restrictions of Versailles with reckless pride. The rearmament of Germany was no longer a whisper in the shadows, but a roar that echoed across factories and foundries. By 1935, the first Panzer divisions were formed, modest by later standards, but revolutionary in concept. The Panzer I, armed with little more than machine guns, was no battlefield titan, but it served as a beginning, a training ground for the men who would one day command iron legions. The Panzer II followed, equipped with a 20mm cannon, still outmatched by heavy armor abroad but fast, mobile, and numerous. These tanks were not designed to stand alone. They were part of a system, a doctrine that fused speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Guderian's vision was clear. Tanks would not crawl across no man's land like in 1916. They would punch through enemy lines like lightning. The world would first feel the weight of this doctrine in September 1939. When German troops invaded Poland, it was not the tank that won the war. It was the tank combined with air power, artillery, and swift infantry. The Polish army fought bravely, but their cavalry and outdated defenses crumbled before the storm. The image of panzers rolling through Polish towns became an early symbol of Nazi might. And though the world condemned the attack, it also marveled at the apparent efficiency of Germany's armored forces. Yet even then, the tanks themselves were not unbeatable. The Polish fielded weapons capable of destroying them. What made the difference was speed. Germany's ability to concentrate armor and smash through weak points before defenders could regroup. Blitzkrieg was not just hardware, it was choreography, and the tanks were the dancers leading the charge. If Poland was a warning, France was the revelation. On May 10, 1940, as the world held its breath, German armor surged westward in a bold and seemingly reckless maneuver. Rather than repeat the old patterns of the First World War by battering through Belgium alone, German commanders gambled on a thrust through the Ardennes, a region dismissed by French planners as impassable for armored divisions. For days, French intelligence refused to believe reports of massed German tanks pushing through forests and winding roads. But when the panzers broke through at Sedan, disbelief turned to horror. Within days, the French defenses collapsed like paper. Entire divisions surrendered, and the world watched in shock as Paris fell in just 6 weeks. The panzers, though still relatively light compared to future models, had proven their worth not by raw strength, but by their ability to strike where they were least expected. The myth of their invincibility was born. The psychological impact of the tanks was as devastating as their physical presence. Soldiers who had grown up with the static images of World War I trenches suddenly faced machines that seemed unstoppable. The thunder of their engines, the shriek of their treads, the blunt muzzle of their guns, all combined into a weapon of terror. German propaganda seized upon this image, portraying the panzers as symbols of a new Reich destined to dominate the continent. Civilians, too, were overwhelmed. Refugees clogged roads as endless columns of steel pushed past them, indifferent to the human tide in their path. It was not just a conquest of land, it was a conquest of imagination, and for a time it appeared as if nothing could halt the armored spearhead of Germany. But even in triumph, weaknesses remained. The Panzer I and II were hopelessly undergunned against heavier Allied tanks like the French Char B1 or the British Matilda II. In several battles, these heavier tanks shrugged off German fire, their armor nearly impervious to the small-caliber guns of early panzers. Yet where one-on-one duels were lost, coordination saved the Germans. Anti-tank guns, airstrikes from the dreaded Stukas, and relentless maneuvering allowed the panzers to bypass or destroy their heavier adversaries. It was here that the Allies began to realize a sobering truth. The German tank was not merely a weapon, it was part of a doctrine that demanded a response not just in engineering, but in strategy. For now, however, the battlefield belonged to Germany. As the dust of France settled, German tank crews carried themselves with a confidence bordering on arrogance. They had achieved in 6 weeks what their fathers could not in 4 years. Europe lay at Hitler's feet, and the myth of the Panzer divisions seemed unshakable. Yet myths, as history would show, are fragile things. With every triumph, the seeds of challenge were planted. In the factories of Britain, in the steelworks of America, and in the endless fields of the Soviet Union, new machines were being conceived. Machines that would meet the panzers head-on. The rule of German tanks was far from eternal, though in the summer of 1940, it seemed as though they had already reshaped the very nature of war itself. The victories of 1939 and 1940 gave the impression of unstoppable might, but deep inside Germany's armored divisions, commanders understood that the Panzer, the Freys, and the II were not the future. They were placeholders, tools of necessity, rather than destiny. Against the French Char B1 and the British Matilda II, German crews had experienced moments of near helplessness, their shells bouncing harmlessly off thick armor. It was only through the orchestration of combined arms, artillery, Stukas screaming overhead, and maneuvering to exploit enemy weakness, that the Wehrmacht had triumphed. Yet Hitler, ever hungry for symbols of dominance, demanded machines that would not just terrify but overwhelm. And so the Panzer III and IV were thrust into the crucible of war, heavier, deadlier, and meant to embody the next stage of German armored supremacy. The Panzer III, armed initially with a 37mm gun, was designed for duels with enemy armor, while the Panzer IV, fitted with a short-barreled 75mm cannon, was conceived as an infantry support vehicle. In practice, these roles blurred and both became the backbone of the Panzerwaffe. Their silhouettes were squat and lethal, their mobility refined, their armor thicker. In the vast fields of Europe, These machines represented an evolution of Blitzkrieg itself, still fast, still coordinated, but now more capable of meeting enemy armor head-on. When German forces turned their gaze eastward in 1941, launching Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, it was the Panzer III and I-4 that spearheaded the drive. Hundreds of divisions stormed across the Soviet frontier, their steel tracks biting into the soil of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The sheer scale of the assault was unprecedented. 3 million men, thousands of aircraft, and over 3,000 tanks moving in unison. For weeks, it seemed as if the Soviet Union itself might collapse under the weight of the armored tide. The early Soviet tanks, the T-26 and BT series, were little match for German precision. Columns of Soviet armor were encircled and obliterated, their wrecks left smoldering in the summer heat. Entire armies were captured. Millions of prisoners marched into captivity. German tank crews, flush with victory, began to believe in their own invincibility. Yet in the shadows of the steppe, something far more formidable lurked. In the autumn of 1941, German troops first encountered the T-34 and the KV-1. The shock was immediate and profound. The T-34, with its sloped armor and 76-meter gun, seemed like a vision from the future. German shells ricocheted uselessly, while the Soviet tank's firepower tore into panzers with devastating effect. The KV-1, a lumbering behemoth, proved almost indestructible to existing German weapons. At first, these encounters were rare, isolated incidents quickly overwhelmed by numbers and tactics. But they planted a seed of dread, a realization that the balance of armored power was shifting. Faced with this new reality, German industry scrambled. The Panzer III's gun was upgraded, its armor thickened, yet it remained vulnerable to the T-34. The Panzer IV, once seen as secondary, was rearmed with a long-barreled 75mm gun, transforming it into the true workhorse of the German armored corps. It was a deadly improvement, one that restored balance for a time, but the Germans had entered a race they could no longer control. The Soviets produced T-34s in staggering numbers, their factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, safe from German bombers, churning out tanks by the thousands. Each month, new waves of armor rolled onto the battlefield. And though the Germans boasted quality, the Soviets wielded quantity, and with every battle, that difference grew more decisive. By 1942, as German forces pushed toward Stalingrad, the myth of the Panzer was no longer unquestioned. Tank crews who once laughed at their foes now whispered of duels that ended in flames. Entire regiments were swallowed by the Russian steppe, their wrecks rusting in fields where the snow buried them like forgotten gravestones. The Panzers were still fearsome, still respected, but their aura of inevitability had cracked. For every village seized, every river crossed, resistance stiffened. At Stalingrad, the armored spearhead faltered, trapped in the hell of urban warfare where their mobility was useless. Tanks built for speed and maneuver found themselves confined to narrow streets, ambushed from rooftops, bombarded by anti-tank rifles hidden in shadows. When the Sixth Army was encircled in the winter of 1942-43, tens of thousands of German soldiers were doomed, and though tanks fought to break the ring, they could not undo the tide. The Soviet Red Army, battered but unbroken, had learned how to fight back. Meanwhile, in the deserts of North Africa, German tanks carved another legend. Under the command of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the Panzer III and I-4 became predators across the shifting sands. Against British Crusaders and early American-built Grants, they proved devastating, their crews masters of maneuver in open terrain. Battles like Gazala in 1942 showed the brilliance of German armored tactics, where feints and encirclements brought entire Allied formations to ruin. Yet even here, victory was fleeting. The British introduced the Sherman, a sturdy and reliable tank mass-produced in American factories. It was not as elegant as a Panzer before, nor as deadly as a Tiger, but it could be built in numbers that dwarfed German capacity. Soon the desert skies filled with Allied planes, the seas with Allied convoys, and the sands that once belonged to Rommel's panzers became a graveyard of burning steel. The German response was the creation of monsters. In 1942, the Tiger I rolled onto the battlefield, a tank that seemed to defy belief. Its armor was so thick that most Allied weapons could not penetrate it head-on, and its 88mm gun destroyed enemy tanks at ranges where they could barely reply. To face a Tiger was to confront death itself. Entire units reported panic when one appeared, and soldiers whispered of its invincibility. Alongside it came the Panther, introduced in 1943, a machine inspired by the T-34's design but refined with German engineering. It carried a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun and sloped armor that gave it a fearsome profile. These tanks, the Tiger and Panther, represented the peak of German armored design, formidable, terrifying, and symbols of a Reich desperate to maintain its grip on the battlefield. Yet every innovation carried its cost. The Tiger and Panther were complex, expensive, and slow to build. For every Tiger that rolled out of a factory, the Allies built dozens of Shermans or T-34s. For every Panther crewed by elite veterans, the Red Army fielded fresh divisions backed by endless reserves. And though German tanks often won duels in open combat, the war was not fought in duels. It was fought in grinding campaigns of attrition. In this, the German machines, however mighty, were doomed. The Allies adapted, developing new weapons like the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, which could pierce even the Tiger's armor. The Americans introduced the M10 tank destroyer and upgraded their Shermans with better guns and armor. The Soviets fielded entire armies of T-34s, overwhelming German units with sheer volume. Slowly, inexorably, the tide turned. By 1943, the stage was set for a clash that would determine the fate of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Kursk. The largest tank battle in history, it pitted thousands of German Panzers, Panthers, and Tigers against waves of Soviet armor. The Germans hoped that their new machines, concentrated in a massive offensive, would crush Soviet defenses once and for all. But the Soviets knew the attack was coming. They prepared deep defenses, minefields, and layered positions. When the German tanks rolled forward in July 1943, they entered a killing ground. Panthers broke down mechanically, Tigers bogged in mud, and waves of T-34s met them head-on. The battle raged for weeks, but when it ended, the Germans had spent their armored strength. Kursk marked the end of German initiative in the east. Never again would they launch such a grand armored assault. From that point on, the Panzerwaffe was on the defensive, its machines fighting desperately to hold back a tide that could no longer be stopped. By the time 1943 gave way to 1944, the myth of German armored invincibility was breaking apart under the weight of Allied industry. The German Tiger and Panther were marvels of engineering, fearsome on the battlefield, but they were also machines bound by fragility and scarcity. They demanded skilled crews, meticulous maintenance, and vast resources of steel, fuel, and labor, resources Germany could no longer afford to squander. For every Tiger that crept onto the front, dozens of Allied tanks thundered across continents, their factories untouchable by the Luftwaffe's dwindling air power. The United States, with its near-limitless industrial capacity, became the arsenal of democracy. In Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, assembly lines churned out Shermans at a staggering pace. Machines that could be shipped to Britain, to the deserts of Africa, to the jungles of the Pacific, and most importantly, to the battlefields of Europe. The Sherman was not invincible. In a duel with a Tiger or Panther, it was outgunned and out-armored, often burning after a single hit. American crews grimly nicknamed it the Ronson, after the lighter that lights every time. Yet the Sherman was reliable, simple to maintain, and, most importantly, produced in overwhelming numbers. Allied strategy accepted losses, knowing replacements would arrive in waves while German crews watched their own numbers dwindle. And the Sherman was not alone. It was joined by tank destroyers like the M10 and M18 Hellcat, and later the British Firefly, a Sherman fitted with the deadly 17-pounder gun, capable of piercing even the Tiger's thick hide. The Allies no longer sought to match German tanks one for one. They sought to drown them in steel, fuel, and firepower. Nowhere was this strategy more evident than on the beaches of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the greatest armada in history delivered Allied soldiers onto the shores of France. Behind them came the tanks. Sherman DD amphibious tanks crawled from the waves, many sinking in rough seas, yet enough survived to push forward and support the infantry. German defenses, formidable and dug in, exacted a terrible price. But once the Allies broke through the hedgerows of Normandy, the battle became one of maneuver, attrition, and supply. Here, the German tanks, mighty though they were, faced their greatest test. Tigers and Panthers lurked in ambush, their guns capable of destroying Allied armor at long range. In the bocage, narrow lanes turned into death traps, and many Allied tank crews lived in constant fear of being struck by an invisible predator. Yet for every Sherman destroyed, another 2, 3, or 4 rolled forward. The German machines, each a masterpiece, could not keep pace with an enemy that fought with factories as much as with guns. Tank duels in Normandy became legendary. In one encounter, a single Tiger held off an entire Allied column, destroying tank after tank before finally being overwhelmed. In another, the British Firefly proved its worth, piercing the armor of a Panther that had once seemed untouchable. Each skirmish told a story of courage and fear, of machines meeting in lethal contests where seconds decided survival. For German crews, every battle was a gamble. Victory in the moment, but at a cost they could never replace. For Allied crews, loss was bitter, but reinforcements gave them strength to push again and again. The battlefield became a paradox. German tanks often won individual fights, yet the Allies won the war of endurance. Beyond Normandy, the Allies unleashed the full fury of mechanized warfare. Operation Cobra shattered German lines, unleashing armored columns that swept across France with dizzying speed. The breakout from the beaches turned into a tidal wave, encircling and annihilating German divisions at the Falaise pocket. Roads clogged with wrecked panzers, their once feared silhouettes reduced to twisted hulks, smoldering under Allied bombs. The Luftwaffe, once the guardian angel of German armor, was nearly absent, driven from the skies by Allied air supremacy. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon became tank killers, their rockets screaming down to turn even the mightiest Tiger into burning wreckage. German crews lived under constant threat from above, their dominance on the ground undercut by a sky they no longer controlled. As Allied forces pushed into Belgium and the Netherlands, the Ardennes, once the scene of German triumph in 1940, became the stage for their last great gamble. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler threw his remaining armored strength into one desperate offensive. The forests once again echoed with the rumble of panzers, and for a fleeting moment history seemed to repeat itself. American units were caught off guard, driven back in the snow, their Shermans burning as German Tigers and Panthers cut swathes through their lines. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of defiance, where surrounded Allied forces held firm despite overwhelming odds. Yet the offensive soon stalled. Fuel shortages strangled German advances. Tanks were abandoned when their engines ran dry. Allied resistance stiffened. Reinforcements poured in, and once the skies cleared, Allied air power unleashed devastation. The last roar of the Panzerwaffe faded into silence, leaving wreckage buried in the frozen Ardennes. By early 1945, German tank crews fought with desperation, knowing their world was collapsing. The once proud Panzer divisions were shadows of themselves, their numbers thinned, their machines battered. Factories bombed by the Allies struggled to produce replacements, and the fuel to run them was vanishing. Yet in scattered battles, Tigers and Panthers still carved moments of terror, their guns tearing through Allied columns. In Berlin itself, as Soviet T-34s poured into the city, desperate German crews fought among the rubble, turning streets into mazes of fire and death. But these were not victories. They were last stands, echoes of a power already broken. The age of German tanks ruling the battlefield had ended, undone by the combined weight of Allied production, air power, and sheer determination. If the Western Allies bled the Panzerwaffe with relentless production and air supremacy, it was in the East that German armor was truly broken. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun with confidence, with panzers slicing deep into enemy territory, but by 1943, The Eastern Front was no longer a battlefield of swift victories. It was an abyss of attrition, swallowing tanks, men, and machines in numbers beyond comprehension. Nowhere else did the myth of German armored invincibility unravel so dramatically. The Soviet Union, once reeling in chaos, had transformed itself into a colossus of industry and endurance, producing not only armies of men but also rivers of steel. The T-34, once a shocking anomaly, became the backbone of the Red Army. Its simplicity was its greatest strength. Built with sloped armor, a powerful gun, and wide tracks suited for mud and snow, it could be manufactured cheaply, repaired quickly, and crewed by barely trained soldiers. For every Panther rolling out of a German factory, the Soviets produced 10, sometimes 20, 34s. The battles on the steppe became clashes of scale unimaginable to the Western Front. In 1943, at Kursk, over 6,000 tanks collided in an inferno of metal and fire. And though German Panthers and Tigers killed in terrifying numbers, they could not kill enough. Soviet defenses were layered in depth, minefields stretching for miles, anti-tank guns hidden in forests and fields, and reserves of armor waiting just beyond the horizon. For every Tiger that roared forward, dozens of T-34s lay in ambush. German crews fought with unmatched skill, knocking out tank after tank, but exhaustion gnawed at them. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, ammunition dwindled. Where one Tiger stood victorious, 3 more were immobilized by breakdowns or lack of fuel. And always the Soviets kept coming. Kursk ended not with a German breakthrough, but with a retreat. It was the turning point, the moment the armored spearhead was blunted forever. From that summer on, the Soviets advanced with relentless momentum. The steppe, once the highway of German victories, now became a graveyard of retreat. In the frozen winters, Soviet tanks pressed forward through snowstorms, their diesel engines more reliable than the gasoline-fueled Panzers that struggled in the cold. In the muddy springs and autumns, T-34s churned forward where German tanks bogged down, their narrower tracks sinking helplessly. Villages burned, cities were retaken, and each counteroffensive pushed the Germans back toward their homeland. The Red Army's armored fist grew stronger with each passing month, reinforced by the Lend-Lease program that supplied not only American-built Shermans, but also trucks, fuel, and equipment that kept the Soviet war machine moving. For German crews, the Eastern Front became a nightmare. They faced an enemy that could replace losses almost instantly, while their own replacements grew scarcer. Each battle consumed tanks faster than they could be built. A single division that began a campaign with 100 Panthers might finish with a dozen still running, their crews exhausted, their machines battered. And yet they fought on, driven by discipline, by desperation, and often by fear of what would happen if they failed. Reports from the front tell of duels where lone Tigers destroyed dozens of enemy tanks, yet the sheer weight of Soviet numbers eventually consumed them. German tankers wrote of endless columns of T-34s cresting the horizon, an unending tide that no amount of skill could turn back. The psychological toll was immense. Where once the sight of a Panzer inspired dread, now the fear belonged to those inside them, knowing that even the most perfect shot was only a brief reprieve before the next wave arrived. By 1944, the Soviet juggernaut had grown unstoppable. Operation Bagration in the summer shattered the German Army Group Center, annihilating hundreds of thousands of soldiers and leaving the Eastern Front in ruins. The Panzers, scattered and depleted, could do little but fight desperate rear guards, their once proud formations reduced to fragments. Entire armored corps ceased to exist, their tanks abandoned on roadsides, out of fuel, out of ammunition, and out of hope. The Soviets advanced with overwhelming force, retaking Minsk, Warsaw, and pressing inexorably toward Berlin itself. For German civilians, the roar of Soviet tanks became the harbinger of collapse. Their once protected homeland now exposed to the vengeance of the Red Army. In the final months of the war, German industry attempted to conjure miracles. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, rolled out in limited numbers, a massive, nearly invulnerable tank with a gun capable of destroying any Allied vehicle from immense range. It was a monster, awe-inspiring in its presence, but it came too late. too few, and too burdened by its own weight and complexity. Mechanical failures plagued it. Fuel shortages crippled its mobility, and Allied bombers destroyed factories faster than replacements could be made. Where King Tigers did fight, they carved terrifying swathes through enemy armor. But they could not change the outcome of a war already lost. When the Soviets finally entered Berlin in April 1945, the last battles of German armor were fought not in sweeping maneuvers, but in the rubble of a dying city. Panthers and Tigers took up ambush positions on city streets, firing at close range, sometimes holding intersections for hours before being blasted apart by artillery or overwhelmed by swarms of T-34s. German crews knew the end had come, yet they fought with the same stubbornness that had defined their campaigns. In some corners, schoolboys armed with Panzerfausts fought alongside veteran tankers, a tragic symbol of a nation in its death throes. The final duels of the Panzerwaffe were not victories, they were elegies, written in fire and smoke across the ruins of the Reich's capital. By May 1945, the myth of German armored supremacy lay in ruins. The panzers that had once ruled Europe were now scattered wrecks across battlefields, stretching from Normandy to Stalingrad. Their story was one of brilliance and brutality, of innovation undone by hubris, of machines that could dominate a duel, but not a war of nations. They had ruled the battlefield for a time, but the Allies, through numbers, industry, and unyielding resolve, had fought back, and in the end, they had won. The age of the Panzer was over. On the Western Front, the Allied armored struggle was a tale of adaptation. The Shermans that rolled off ships into Normandy were not meant to match the German Tiger or Panther in a straight duel. They were meant to overwhelm through numbers, coordination, and relentless pressure. Yet Allied crews, thrown into the bocage of France, quickly learned the terrible truth. To face a Panther head-on was to gamble with death. Their shells often bounced off its sloped armor, while the German 75mm high-velocity gun could punch through them with ease. In the first weeks after D-Day, American tank battalions suffered horrific losses, with some crews destroyed before ever firing a shot. The grim joke spread, a Sherman needs 5 to kill 1 Panther and 4 have to burn first. Still, the Allies pressed forward. For every Sherman destroyed, replacements poured in. What the Germans saw as waste, the Allies saw as inevitability. But the Allies were not content to fight only with numbers. They innovated. The British, who had already developed specialized tanks for Normandy, the so-called Hobart's funnies, with flails for mines and bridges for rivers, unleashed a weapon that changed. Duels with German armor, the Sherman Firefly. Armed with the powerful 17-pounder gun, the Firefly could penetrate even the thick armor of a Tiger from long range. Crews took solace in the fact that, at last, they had a weapon capable of striking back. American units, too, introduced tank destroyers like the M36 Jackson, mounting a 90mm gun that could duel Panthers on more equal terms. Slowly, painfully, the balance began to shift, not because Allied tanks suddenly outclassed their opponents, but because innovation closed the gap, while air power, artillery, and logistics widened it. The rhythm of armored combat in Western Europe was not a series of grand sweeping maneuvers, but a grinding push through fields, forests, and towns. After Normandy, battles raged across the French countryside, through hedgerows, then into the open plains. In Operation Cobra, American tanks poured through the gap, racing across France faster than the Germans could respond. Panthers and Tigers fought desperate holding actions, ambushing columns, striking with deadly precision, then retreating. But each engagement drained irreplaceable machines and crews. When the Allies encircled German forces in the Falaise pocket, the roads became graveyards of steel. Burnt-out panzers littered the countryside, their crews gone, their fuel tanks empty. For the Allies, these sights were grim proof that the tide had turned. For the Germans, they were omens of collapse. Even so, German armor remained feared. In late 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American tankers confronted the nightmare once more. In the snowbound forests of the Ardennes, Panthers and Tigers prowled like ghosts, their shells blasting Shermans apart in white silence. Stories spread of Tigers destroying entire platoons in minutes, of ambushes where American crews had no chance. Yet the Allies did not break. Bastogne held. Air power returned as skies cleared, hammering German armor on frozen roads, and the German offensive, bold as it was, collapsed under its own weight. Many of their vaunted tanks never reached battle, abandoned when fuel ran dry. Allied tankers, who once feared every duel, began to sense the larger truth. The Germans could no longer sustain their armored war. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany in 1945, armored combat became both desperate and surreal. Panthers still lurked in ambush. King Tigers prowled in scattered formations, and each encounter could still cost lives. Yet these duels no longer decided campaigns. The Allies advanced with overwhelming superiority, columns of Shermans and Churchills supported by endless artillery and airstrikes. German tank crews fought to the last, but their fate was sealed long before the final shot. In Cologne, a famous duel unfolded as a lone Panther faced advancing Shermans in the ruins of the city. For minutes it held its ground, destroying tanks with chilling precision until an American tank destroyer found its mark. The Panther burned in the street, its death captured on film, a symbol of German power undone. For Allied tank crews, the war had been a crucible. They had entered France with machines many felt were inadequate, but they had endured, adapted, and triumphed. Their Shermans, mocked for their thin armor, had carried them from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. Their Fireflies had slain Tigers. Their tank destroyers had met Panthers head-on, and their sheer numbers had overwhelmed the German war machine. It had not been an easy road, casualties were staggering, and bravery alone could not erase the fear of German armor. But by the end, the Allies had proven that even the mightiest tanks could be brought down by determination, adaptation, and relentless pressure. By 1945, the German Panzer divisions no longer represented the unstoppable spearheads of 1940 or the deadly hunters of Kursk. They had become shadows of themselves, scattered, starved of fuel, and deprived of the crews who once gave them life. Yet even in this twilight, the German tanks retained a grim power, haunting every road, every ruined town, every forest path the Allies advanced through. Soldiers advancing westward toward the Rhine or eastward into Silesia could never quite shake the feeling that somewhere, just ahead, a Panther waited in ambush, its gun trained, its crew ready to sacrifice themselves for a war that was already lost. Each duel in these final months felt like a tragedy, not a turning point. Machines and men destroyed in battles that no longer had meaning. Only inevitability. The collapse of the Panzerwaffe was not only material but spiritual. The fuel shortages were catastrophic. Tigers and King Tigers, marvels of engineering on paper, became useless hulks without the gasoline to move. Many were abandoned by their crews, blown up to prevent capture, or left rusting in ditches by the roadside. In some cases, they were deployed as static defenses, dug into the earth like bunkers, their turrets barely able to traverse. The sight was pitiful. Weapons once meant to spearhead lightning wars reduced to immobile tombstones for a dying Reich. And yet, when these tanks did fight, they still demanded respect. An ambush in the ruins of a German village could wipe out a column of Shermans or T-34s before the tank was itself overwhelmed. Each encounter reminded Allied and Soviet crews alike that a cornered beast is no less dangerous, only more desperate. The Eastern Front in 1945 offered the most brutal examples of this desperation. As Soviet armies thundered westward with thousands of T-34s and new IS-2 heavy tanks, the Germans responded with their last great armored weapon, the Königstiger, or King Tiger. With armor so thick that many Soviet shells bounced harmlessly off, and a gun capable of killing a T-34 from 2 kilometers, it was a terrifying opponent. Yet the King Tiger was a paradox, invincible in a duel, but crippled by its own weight and fuel consumption. Soviet commanders learned to avoid direct confrontation, relying instead on artillery, air power, and sheer numbers to encircle and annihilate them. Time and again, entire battalions of King Tigers were destroyed not in glorious tank battles, but by abandonment, lack of fuel, or relentless bombardment. Their hulks littered the roads to Berlin, monuments to the futility of German engineering brilliance without the resources to sustain it. In the West, American and British tankers found themselves fighting similar battles of attrition. In towns like Cologne, Wesel, and across the Ruhr, German Panthers struck from rubble-strewn streets, using every corner as a killing ground. In one haunting engagement captured on film in Cologne, a single Panther destroyed multiple Shermans before being finally knocked out by an American tank destroyer. Scenes like this burned themselves into the memories of Allied soldiers, symbols of how dangerous even one German tank could be. But by now, the outcome was never in doubt. For every Panther lost, the Germans could not replace it. For every Sherman or Cromwell destroyed, the Allies had 10 more crossing the Rhine. The battlefield itself told the story. Where once panzers advanced in proud formation, they now appeared as isolated wrecks, their destruction inevitable, their legend dying with them. The final battles for Berlin encapsulated this transformation. German youth, barely trained, climbed into tanks they could scarcely drive, commanded by officers who knew their lives were being thrown away for nothing. Panthers and Tigers defended streets against swarms of Soviet armor, firing point-blank, destroying dozens, but they were swallowed by the tide. Tank duels turned into suicidal last stands, explosions echoing through city blocks as steel beasts burned in front of the Reichstag. To Soviet crews, victory was costly but certain. To German crews, every engagement was a death sentence. The last panzers died as they had lived, feared, respected, but finally crushed beneath the weight of a world united against them. And yet, even in defeat, the myth endured. Allied soldiers, standing beside the hulks of destroyed Tigers, could not help but feel awe at their sheer size and power. Many took photographs beside them, marveling at machines that had once seemed invincible. In the years after the war, these images would fuel a fascination with German tanks, painting them as legends of battlefield dominance, even as their real history told a story of brilliance consumed by hubris, of innovation undone by overreach. The German tank had ruled the battlefield once, but in 1945 it became the relic of a defeated dream. The war ended, but the legend of the German tank did not die with it. In the burned-out husks of Tigers and Panthers strewn across Europe, in the stories whispered by veterans who had faced them, and in the black-and-white photographs carried home by Allied soldiers, the German Panzer became something more than a weapon. It became a myth. To some, it represented terror and destruction, a symbol of mechanized war at its most ruthless. To others, it embodied engineering genius, the pinnacle of armored design, a standard against which all future tanks would be measured. In truth, it was both, and neither. For though the German tanks had once ruled the battlefield, their dominance was fleeting, undone by the very flaws that would shape the wars to come. In the post-war years, militaries around the world studied the lessons of the Panzerwaffe. The Panther's sloped armor inspired designs in both East and West. Soviet engineers adopted it into the T-54, a machine that would become the backbone of the Red Army and dominate Cold War battlefields. In the West, American and British designs drew on what they had learned from fighting German armor. The need for firepower, protection, and mobility balanced in equal measure. Tanks like the American M48 Patton and the British Centurion carried the DNA of wartime lessons, marrying reliability with power in a way the Germans had never managed. The myth of invincibility that had once cloaked the Tiger now fueled the determination of Allied engineers to ensure their machines would never again be outclassed so completely. Yet the fascination endured. Historians, collectors, and even filmmakers kept the German tank alive in memory. Books painted them as fearsome titans, and veterans spoke with awe of their encounters, even when those encounters ended in victory. In truth, the aura of the Panzer was shaped as much by perception as by reality. They had ruled because they were new, because the world was unprepared, and because their enemies had yet to adapt. Once adaptation came, once the Allies forged their Shermans into a blunt, unstoppable hammer, and the Soviets unleashed their waves of T-34s, the myth cracked. What remained was not invincibility, but the recognition that even the most powerful machines could be beaten through resilience, innovation, and sheer willpower. The human cost of this armored struggle cannot be forgotten. Inside every tank, German or Allied, were men, young, frightened, determined, who faced death with every engagement. For every Tiger destroyed, a crew of 5 met their fate in fire and steel. For every Sherman burned, 5 more families mourned their sons. The legends of the machines too often overshadow the humanity of those inside them. They were not just symbols of nations' power, but coffins on tracks, carrying lives that could be snuffed out in an instant. In this sense, the story of German tanks is not just one of mechanical dominance, but of human endurance, sacrifice, and tragedy. As the Cold War unfolded, the myth of German tanks became a weapon of its own. NATO and Warsaw Pact planners measured their arsenals against ghosts of the past, ensuring that their own machines would never be found wanting in the crucible of battle. Tank against tank, design against design, they built armies of steel in the shadow of the Panzers. Yet none would ever hold the same symbolic power. The German tanks of World War II belonged to a unique moment in history, when speed, surprise, and innovation collided with unprepared enemies. They were creatures of their time, their dominance fleeting, their downfall inevitable. And so, when we remember the Panzers today, we remember not just their power, but their lesson. No force, no machine, no empire can rule unchallenged forever. Innovation breeds counter-innovation, dominance sparks resistance, and what seems unstoppable becomes vulnerable in time. The German tanks ruled the battlefield once, terrifying the world into submission. But they were overcome, not by one weapon, not by one nation, but by the combined determination of those who refused to bow. Their story is a reminder that even the mightiest machines are only as strong as the cause they serve, and that no machine, however fearsome, can outlast the will of humanity to resist, to adapt, and to endure.